crimes against humanity. And we'll also discuss about what has been so far and what should be the European Union's response to these crimes. This event is recorded and is also live streamed on YouTube as we speak. The event is kindly hosted by members of the European Parliament, Rafael Glucksmann from the Socialist and Democrats Group, Miriam Lexman from the European People's Party, Engin Eroglu from Renew Europe, and last but not least, Rainer Bütikofer from the Greens EFA. My name is Claudio Francavilla and I'm the EU Advocacy Officer at Human Rights Watch in Brussels. And I'll be moderating today as we hear from our hosts and from my colleague Sophie Richardson, who is our China Director at Human Rights Watch, and Jueri Lam is a Uyghur author and human rights activist. Her father, Hilam Tohti, is the recipient of the 2019 Sakharov Prize from the European Parliament. As I said, the event is recorded and live streamed. Just perhaps before I leave the floor to Mr. Glucksmann for some initial remarks, a word about the context. As people who are watching us probably know, since 2019, the European Union has decided to compartmentalize its relations with China, seen as a systemic rival on some issues, notably human rights, and as a partner in others like climate change. At the same time, the Commission and some member states have been pushing for closer trade relations. And last year, the conclusion in principle for the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, or CAI, was announced. But then in March this year, the EU finally adopted aggressive sanctions against some Chinese officials precisely over the issues that we'll be discussing today. And China immediately retaliated with counter-sanction against some European parliamentarians and other entities, including three of our co-hosts today. So relations are now much more confrontational, and the prospects of that CAI will move forward at this stage seem extremely low as things stand. Without further ado, I'll just leave the floor for some initial remarks to Mr. Glucksmann and then to the other co-host. Please, Mr. Glucksmann.
Thank you, Claudio, and thank you all for joining us. Sterilization campaign, mass detention, reduction of an entire nation into slavery. We have, against the Uyghur, a clear definition of a crime against humanity. And I want to thank really Human Rights Watch for this report. I think it's a very important report. And there was thinking in Beijing for a very long period that they could commit this crime against humanity while escaping any form of price to be paid for this kind of crime. And the first thing that they wanted to organize in the Chinese government was a total black hole around the fate of the Uyghur nation and other Turkic minorities. And thanks to Human Rights Watch and other organizations, this black hole was broken, and this wall of silence was broken. Because the first thing when you have a crime against humanity, the first thing to do is to document, analyze, and publicize the facts. And this is the biggest weapon we have against the Chinese Communist Party as it stands now. So documenting the facts, publicizing them, making recommendations to policymakers, this is of the utmost importance as we speak now. And clearly, for a very long period, for 3 years, our executive branches, but also our media and our public debates, were far too silent when it came to the crime against humanity that the Uyghur were suffering. The situation is quite changing now, but we are not there yet. We didn't yet took the actions that will impose in Beijing calculation between benefits and cost of this crime. And this is what we have to impose on Beijing. Nobody wants to go to war against China. But between doing nothing and going to war. There is a huge space which is called politics. And that's what we want to do. And it implies trade sanctions. It implies personal sanctions. It implies rapport de force, we say in French. That's European leaders were for so long reluctant to have and to shape. And I think now we are facing a litmus test with these sanctions. Will we be strong enough to resist these pressures and make sure that human rights are at the top of the European agenda when it comes to China? Or would we give in to gentle pressures from companies connected to the Chinese market or to the Chinese production apparatus and basically keep our values under the carpet? And this is really a test, not only about our China policy, but about what kind of Europe we want for ourselves. And this is why I don't think that it's just a discussion on foreign policy. It's also a discussion why we shaped this Europe, why we entered politics, and why we still think or not, whether we still think or not, that we have a voice to be heard in this world and principles to stand on. So thank you really very much. I'm looking forward to hearing Ms. Richardson and Ms. Joey Lam, and to participate in this discussion. Thank you to my dear friends from the European Parliament for co-hosting this debate. We come from different political groups, but we join ourselves and our forces when it comes to the very basic principles of human dignity.
Thank you, Mr. Gosson, for your word, especially on the values indeed, and on the price to pay and on the calculations that the government in Beijing has made. Mr. Roglu.
First of all, I'm very happy to be a part of this event today. Thank you. This topic is extremely important. Thank you all for your time now. Also, thank you, Sophie and Yeva, for being with us. For too long, the situation of the Uyghurs has hidden from the eyes of the world. But today, there is a real understanding that the crimes against humanity and genocide are taking place in Xinjiang. This is despite the fact that the Chinese government has tried so hard to cover up this crime. So we need to use this moment now. I think it's very important for the UN to open an investigation commission, not only for the crimes against the humanity, but also for the genocide. When genocide happens, often crimes against humanity are also brought to trial. I think it's very important, this topic. So we need to let the Uyghurs know that we see them and we stand up for them. We need to make sure that this ongoing horror comes to the end. So also, I thank you all for your time now. It's very important now what we do. Thank you, Reinhard. Thank you, Miriam and Raphael. Also, thank you for your perfect work on this topic. And so I hope that we have a good time the next 40 minutes to bring up this topic in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Roglu. Indeed, important to note how the rhetoric from the government has always been one of denial of the situation, and how important it is indeed to have a commission of inquiry or other UN investigation as soon as possible. And we will talk about that in a minute. But please, Ms. Lexman.
Thank you very much, Claudio. Thank you to Human Rights Watch and to Sophie and Ilham for being with us. Thank you very much to all my colleagues and to everyone who is interested in this topic and is trying to do his or her best to change the situation in China. We are facing a moment where one of the biggest economic partner is committing genocide against Uyghurs, is increasing the human rights breaches and pressure against different kind of minorities and groups in religious but also political groups in China, is breaching international laws vis-a-vis Taiwan and Hong Kong, and is also undermining our democracies is influencing political decision-making in our democracies and is corrupting our economic system and our businesses. And I think this is very important, that we are realizing and waking up into a moment where our economic partner is doing all this evil against us and against other human beings in China and Chinese territory. And I think for some time, I believe that honestly, we as a West believe that through economic engagement with China, we can change China. We can improve the human rights situation in China. We can open up the business communities and the business and economic world into free world. But I think it was already some years ago, we have realized that this does not work, that through economic engagement, China, but other totalitarian regimes have learned how to use our economic interest against us and in order to improve its position and its totalitarian regime. And now we stand in front of a moment where we have to realize that if we continue business as usual, we are becoming morally co-responsible for the genocide and for the human rights breaches in China and other totalitarian regimes. And I think that's why we have to make a U-turn. We have to combine our economic interests with our human rights, with the human rights policies we embrace and with our values we embrace. And we cannot push only for the economic interest, but we have to use the engagement in order to change the human rights situation in China, because it is possible if we will put the price very clearly, and if we put our conditions very clearly, I think we can achieve improvements, but we have to be united. And I think this is a moment where we all have to unite. I guess that it is happening now, that I see it around me, my colleagues in the European Parliament, but also political leaders in Slovakia, country I come from, and I come from an ex-communist country. And it's one of the reasons why I feel as my moral responsibility to pay attention to the human rights breaches of other countries where they suffer under communist regime, because there was help to my country when we were suffering this regime. I think it's our moral duty to help further. So I'll finish here. Thanks to everyone who is involved in this conference and in the report, which is very important. And I look forward to our cooperation in order to change and improve the situation of human beings and our dear friends in China. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lexman. Important words on the unity as well, and perhaps nothing as much as the targeted sanctions that Beijing adopted against European entities has managed to unite the European Parliament on this topic, as is testified indeed by the co-hosting of this event by many political groups across the aisle. Mr. Bütikofer.
Thank you, Claudio, for it's a great honor and a pleasure to team up with my dear colleagues from the European Parliament and also with dear friends from the United States. The report, the presentation of which we're hosting today, makes important arguments that we want to spread as far as we can. Because even though there has been an awakening, I would say, and even though the perception has become more realistic of what really is happening in Xinjiang, still there's a long way to go, and we must work together internationally to make people understand what the reality amounts to really make them understand how these atrocities are impacting so many million people's lives. And some of us have also been active in the context of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China. And from that, I draw the conclusion that working together internationally is of utmost importance to really tackle a challenge that is indeed an international challenge. Europe is in a period that I would describe as a transformative period for our China policy. 2 years ago, the European Union, for the first time ever, defined China also as a systemic rival. For a while, people were kind of uneasy with this definition. A couple of our leaders, like the German Chancellor, have never used the term so far, but it is indeed sinking in what it means, and Europeans are increasingly realizing what it means to have a systemic rival, a country that works for the exactly opposite values, or at least maybe they don't have any values, but at least they want to fight ours, a country that is not pursuing an international rules-based order, but big power politics. And sometimes things move fast. By the end of last year, the comprehensive agreement on investment was concluded under particularly heavy pressure from the German Chancellor's office. But since we've had a major fallout, and indeed today the CAI is in the deep freezer, and as long as these sanctions against some of us are still in place, it will not get on the agenda, which does not imply that if the sanctions would be dropped, that we would then rush to adopt it. All the criticisms that we had in the first place, with particular the criticism regarding the fact that the treaty does not do anything about forcing China to ratify ILO core conventions against forced labor, those criticisms, of course, still stand, and we will push hard for them. But indeed, as Claudio said, through its antagonizing actions, China has managed to unite us. And also looking forward, I think there are more things that we should discuss and that we should try to work on together. And I'm just mentioning here the upcoming Winter Olympics in Beijing, February next year. Frankly, that could be termed the slave labor Olympics. And I think we cannot just stand by and let it happen and be part of the party. So this is why some of us have started advocating, and I also hope that we can work on that together, advocating for a political and economic boycott of those Winter Olympics, pretty much on the lines that originally Senator Romney proposed in one of his op-eds. I think it was in the New York Times. So there's much on which we can work together, and I'm glad that we're doing this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bütikofer. Indeed, very important points. And I just want to inform everyone who is following us that they can start to type some questions in the Q&A box down there, and we will collect them after the presentations that we'll hear from Sophie and from Juer. But let me turn to Sophie Hitcherson, our China director, to tell us a bit more about the report that we recently published. Sophie, what is going on in Xinjiang? What are our findings?
First of all, thank you, Claudio. And second, but maybe should be first, thank you so much to our friends in the European Parliament who have shown such interest in and dedication to this issue, but also I find very moving and inspiring the way each of you speaks about this issue in terms of our collective humanity and the importance of international standards, and not just as an abstract strategic or political matter, that you care about what happens to human beings in another country, and that you will work towards the betterment of their situation is an inspiration to us. So thank you very much for that. Claudia, to answer your question, The report that we've just published in conjunction with the Stanford Law School's Human Rights and Conflict Resolution Clinic shows that the Chinese government has been committing and continues to commit. I want to stress that part. It continues to commit crimes against humanity against Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Tajiks, and other Turkic communities across the Uyghur region. The report sets forth the factual basis for that conclusion, assessing available information about Chinese government actions in the region, but analyzed within the framework of international human rights law. It builds largely on 2 decades of Human Rights Watch work looking at different issues across the region, but also on the work of scholars and other activists, researchers, journalists, and perhaps most importantly, leaked Chinese government documents that make very clear now that authorities have been planning this campaign for quite some time. Crimes against humanity are serious, specific offenses knowingly committed, this is a key piece, knowingly committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack against a civilian population. And they are among the gravest human rights abuses under international law. We know that the Chinese authorities have been committing human rights violations for quite some time in the region, but they have reached an unprecedented scope and scale. The crimes that we document in the report include imprisonment or other deprivation and violation of deprivation of liberty in violation of international law, persecution of an identifiable ethnic or religious group, enforced disappearance, torture, murder, and alleged inhumane acts intentionally causing great suffering to mental or physical health, including forced labor or sexual violence. As mentioned earlier, the Chinese government has repeatedly denied that there are abuses taking place at all in the region. And our primary recommendation at the moment to governments is to back an investigation under the auspices of the UN that would almost certainly at this point have to be conducted outside the country because the Chinese government has been so obstructionist about this. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about recommendations, but I've found that it helps in presenting this report to talk about some of the human beings who have been affected by this campaign. And so I want to highlight as examples of the kinds of cultural persecution we've documented, a woman named Harigul Nasir, who was given a 10-year sentence simply for promoting the idea of wearing headscarves. That's all she did. That the grave of Lutfullah Mutella, a prominent Uyghur poet who was executed by the authorities in 1945, that his grave was destroyed in order to make way for a children's park. In terms of family separations, in November 2016, Chen Chuanguo, the party secretary, put in place a new order to put all quote unquote orphans into state institutions by 2020. And by orphans, the authorities meant any child who was not living with a parent. So even if an aunt, an uncle, a cousin, grandparents were available to look after a child, those children were meant to be institutionalized. In 2019, we spoke to a man named Abdurrahman Toci in Turkey, whose wife had been detained in Xinjiang. And he had no idea what had happened to their children, who at that time were 3 and 4, until he saw a video of them on an online streaming platform. This is generations of people being taken away from their parents with no information, no consent about what's happening to them, which I find a particularly chilling phenomenon. And then last but certainly not least, for those of you who may have had the very moving privilege of listening to the testimony last week of Tursunay Ziauddin, whose allegations that she had been raped on 3 separate occasions during her 9 months in arbitrary detention, many of the other aspects of her detention described. These are chilling and deliberate and require the kind of accountability that we've seen the international community mobilize on behalf of the Rohingya or North Koreans, Venezuelans, Yemenis. So I'm going to stop there and pass the baton back to Claudio, but then hopefully we can come back to some of the EU and EP specific recommendations we'd like to share with you. Thanks.
Yes, thanks, Hofi. And indeed, before we move to the recommendations part, or to the action part from the international community, in particular from the EU, let's dig a bit more on the situation. Let's hear the testimony from Juer, who is very, also personally involved into what's going on the ground.
Thank you very much, Claudio. Hello, everyone. My name is Jawhar Ilham. I am Uyghur. First of all, I'd like to thank Sophie for, asking me to attend this event. And I also would like to thank all the European Parliament members who are willing to attend and host this very important event. And this is such an important topic and issue that needs to be addressed more often. I am not a policy expert like most of you, and I'm also not a scholar like my father. But today I would like to share with you a little bit about what I know and what my family and I have been through. It has been over 4 years since I heard anything of my father, and it has been 7 years since I have, last spoken to him. And it has been over 8 years since I have seen him. My father, Ilham Tohti, as introduced earlier, was a scholar and an intellectual. He was one of the very first Uyghur who was arrested, and he was also the one of the first people who holds a Chinese passport that received a life sentence since the Cultural Revolution. But all he ever did was fostering dialogue between the Han Chinese and the Uyghurs, and for advocating respect for religious and cultural belief of our people, and for equal opportunity in pursuing our dreams and the things that motivate us. And my father is a very noble man with a big heart. He has won numerous awards, including the 2019 European Sakharov Award, and he was nominated for Nobel Peace Prize a few times. But over 8 years ago, on February 2nd, 2013, my father was stopped at the airport from leaving the country. And yes, I remember the date so clearly. I probably would never forget this date. And my father and I were on our way to America together. He was to be a visiting scholar at Indiana University, and I was a teenager, a freshman in college. I just started studying Arabic, hoping to become a translator one day, and was only planning to stay in the US for 2 or 3 weeks to help my father settle down. But as you can see, I'm still here and never left. Not working on translating Arabic to Chinese or English, but working on translating my family's experiences and stories and telling them to the world, just to get my family free and safe. And at this moment, I am on the other side of the world, away from my family and my home. And that was the last time I saw my father and my younger brothers. My father was released home from the airport a few days later, but his freedom was still restrained. He wasn't really allowed to teach, nor really be allowed to go far from his apartment without permission. And in other words, he was under house arrest. And that continued for 11 months. My father didn't complain because it had become a normality for his life, our lives. And the Chinese government had detained him, threatened him, and put him under house arrest many, many, many times. But my father always told me that, my dear, it's okay. Let's be strong. And that's what kind of person my father is. January 15th, 2014, 11 months after we were separated at the airport, more than 20 policemen broke into our apartment in Beijing and arrested my father in front of my 2 little brothers, who were 4 and 7 years old. My poor little brothers were deeply traumatized. One of them even started having heart issues. And my little brothers, whom I was very, very close with, had to grow up without a father figure for over 7 years. And my stepmother had to raise 2 boys all on her own. And I had to live away from my father and family on the other side of the world alone for the past 8 years. And it has been 4 years since I haven't heard any news of my father. Family visits were no longer allowed since 2017. And when my father was first arrested in 2014, he was shackled, beaten, and denied for food twice, each time for 10 days. And I wonder what's his current condition now. My family and I have very strong concerns over his current safety and his health conditions. The treatment of an internationally known scholar like my father's is already this bad. I wonder how bad the situation and conditions can be for the other Uyghur families who don't have family relatives that are able to speak up for them overseas, and for those who are not able to let their stories and names to be told to the world. I wonder what they are going through right now. And over the past few years, I have learned that it has been estimated by scholars and researchers that the Chinese government has rounded up over 1 to 1.8 million Uyghurs and other Turkic and Muslim majority people, and been sending them to prison camps, labor camps, or in the other words that the Chinese government calls vocational training schools. And some have been transported away from home to other parts of China, where people have been working in factories under conditions that strongly indicate forced labor. And those are systematic and state-sponsored forms of forced labor, which intersects with other types of egregious human rights abuses, which includes undermining our culture and our customs, widespread arbitrary detention, political indoctrination and transformation, family separation, pervasive surveillance, and forced sterilization. And of course, as Sophie mentioned earlier, gender-based sexual harassments. The Chinese government claims that those so-called vocational training schools with barbed fences and watchtowers are for vocational training and poverty alleviation purposes. I really wish that was true. And I promise you, I really wish this was the truth. But unfortunately, the truth that I learned are that families have been separated, hearts have been torn, children and wives have been screaming and crying for the missing or the loss of their fathers, husbands, brothers, uncles, aunts, sisters, cousins, and mothers, and so many more. And please tell the world that this is not okay to be still happening in the 21st century or in any time of any era. Some of you may have heard my stories many times. You might have attended an event that I've spoken at before, but in my heart, my voice still hasn't been heard. I have told the story, if not 500 times, but at least 100 times for the past 7 years. But our voices hasn't been heard, and it hasn't been heard by the Chinese government. My father is still serving a life sentence in a Chinese prison. Hundreds of thousands of, even millions of Uyghurs are not free yet. And I will continue speaking up on this issue until the Chinese government hear our voice and until the Chinese government release all of these innocent souls and allow them to go back to their families and loved ones. And that day I will know our voices finally have been heard. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy, for this powerful words. It's always heartbreaking to hear about this, but it's also a very important testimony that reminds us that, you know, we're not talking about politics, we're not talking about economics, we're not talking about numbers, we're talking about real people and families torn apart. And that's what we should keep in mind always when we decide whether or not to take action and which action to take, in fact. I will turn back to Sophie indeed to give us an overview of what our main calls to the EU, and if you also want to add a word about what we think about what's been so far the EU's action on these issues.
Well, it's certainly been good to hear the EU speak, for example, at the Human Rights Council, and for individual member states to join different initiatives and for the targeted sanctions that were imposed recently. But there's a great deal more, we believe, that the EU can and indeed should do. So I'm going to try to group these recommendations together a little bit to perhaps enable some discussion. But on the very important issue that Johar mentions about forced labor, Human Rights Watch is a very proud member of the Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uyghur region, which is an effort essentially to get companies to withdraw, because we all know they can't do the kind of robust human rights due diligence that they ought to do. And in that vein, we suggest that the EU urge companies to adhere to the call to action of that campaign to end Uyghur forced labor, that companies have to say that they will not try to benefit or profit from this. The EU can also ensure that companies and trade don't contribute in other ways to forced labor and other kinds of human rights violations across China. And we certainly very strongly support the idea that the consideration of the CAI is suspended until meaningful human rights improvements and safeguards can be secured. We're very skeptical about what was originally in the document. And while we don't obviously think the sanctions on various EU friends are a good idea, we're certainly not sorry for the pause that's been created in that debate. One other area that matters, we think, enormously to longer term change inside China is the idea that Chinese government officials should be held accountable for their conduct. This is what would happen in the face of any other comparable human rights crisis in other countries. And the Chinese government for a long time, as several of our EP friends have mentioned, have gotten away with these abuses. And in that sense, we strongly urge additional targeted sanctions against Chinese government officials responsible for serious human rights violations. Chen Chuanguo, who's the party secretary, has yet to be targeted. That's one place to start, but there are others who could certainly be a topic or a target of those kinds of sanctions. We would really encourage at the national level the prosecuting Chinese officials through universal jurisdiction laws, as was recently done in Germany for Syrians involved in cases of torture. We think there's more that the EU can do to help push for international support for an independent investigation into serious human rights violations, crimes against humanity across the Uyghur region. There's been a bit of a fruitless discussion between the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Chinese government for more than 2 years now about allowing unfettered access across the region. I think it's very clear that the Chinese government has no intention of offering the kind of access that would be necessary for a credible investigation. And so we are strongly pushing the idea of carrying out that investigation, fact gathering, outside the country, and also very strongly urging the High Commissioner for Human Rights to exercise her independent monitoring and reporting mandate to put this issue squarely on the Human Rights Council's agenda. We'll be hosting another event tomorrow with New York missions of the US, the UK, and Germany to advance this idea, and a number of EU member states have joined that event as co-sponsors. And then last but not least, this is a frequent challenge we know for the EU, is to try to remain united in these efforts. When the EU speaks with one voice, it is very powerful. That said, as we know about the considerations around the EU imposing consequences on Hong Kong and central government officials for essentially the devastation of democracy in Hong Kong that's been blocked by Hungary, we wouldn't want unity to be the enemy of useful interventions. And so if you can only get all but one on board, by all means proceed in that route. But when the EU can stick together on these issues, it's much stronger. And I believe as Ms. Lexman mentioned, we now live in a time when the Chinese government actually poses a threat, not just to human rights violations inside China, but inside the EU as well, and to EU institutions. And so I think there's a very strong incentive to push back, to try to hold the Chinese government accountable, and to make sure that European institutions are strong in upholding the highest possible standards of human rights. So maybe I'll stop there. I don't want to go on for too long, and I think we've got a couple of questions coming in from the chat. So Claudio, back to you.
Thank you, Sophie. Thanks as well for this list of recommendations. And I mean, on some of those, there has already been some action, and we have here Mr. Glucksmann as well, who has been one of the leading figures in the European Parliament, for instance, for the due diligence legislation for companies, which might have a cross-cutting impact, not only to address the situation in Xinjiang, but also in other places in the world. And there are indeed some works and some ideas floating around about an import ban on forced labor goods that likewise could have a cross-cutting effect, not only on Xinjiang, but also elsewhere. One question we have received, and this is an issue, the situation in Xinjiang, which has gotten more and more, if you will, popular, known to the general public, also thanks to campaigns, social media activity, op-eds, etc., documentaries of sorts. And so one question has been, what can we as European citizens, what can the general public do in order to foster accountability for the crimes that have been documented by Human Rights Watch and others? I don't know if maybe actually Mr. Glucksmann himself may want to also address this one. And let me remind everybody who's attending to please type their questions in the chat. We will not be given the floor at this stage, unfortunately, but we are happy to take questions in writing. Thank you.
Yeah, let me just say how much I agree with what Sophie just said. We are not there yet. I mean, it was already a form of miracle that the European institution and 27 member states could agree on sanctions, but they were very limited, and they had a symbolic cost for Chinese government, but not an effective one. And if we want to make the Chinese government have this calculation about benefits and costs, then obviously what we need is a much more efficient system of measures. And the first one is clearly an import ban on products of slavery, because that will have an impact on the Chinese apparatus and officials that are deciding the policies. And this, we are not there yet. We are pushing for that, but it's very slow, as you know. And my fear now is that since our leaders have done something brave, which they are not used to do, and you had this counter-reaction of the Chinese authorities, that the mood will be, okay, we did it, so business as usual. No, there is no business as usual as long as you have concentration camps. And there is no business as usual as long as you have a nation reduced to slavery and women being systematically sterilized. There cannot be business as usual. And that's why we are pushing for that, but we are not there yet. It's very hard, and we have to say it. I mean, a lot of interests are struggling not to have this import ban. You have to understand that when we discuss China, we are not discussing a faraway country. In fact, we are discussing a country that is so integrated into our economy that the embassies, the lobbyists we are fighting in the European Parliament are not the lobbyists of the Chinese government, or companies hired by the Chinese embassy. When you speak about serious trade measures, then you speak to Volkswagen, to Siemens, to Zara. Your interlocutors are Europeans that have made so much money out of their relation with China that they will try to block any attempt to have serious measure. So, but this is the objective. And as you mentioned, the due diligence legislation, this is clearly what we have to shape. And this is a way for Europe to show that it stands seriously with this principle, not only by words. And if we manage to have that, and actually right now in the Parliament we had a very good text, not perfect one, but still very ambitious. And if we manage to have a directive from the Commission that is reflecting our request, then it will have an impact. And we won't even need political bravery, because I don't count on that too much, but we will have the ways to actually implement this ban. But it will take time again, and that's the thing. So what can citizens do? First, let me stress, for instance, when I speak about France, how much citizens have put the Uyghur cause in the center of the debate. Not media, not a political establishment, but citizens themselves on social networks especially. And so they have to go on sharing these reports, sharing information, sharing the testimonies, calling on their elected officials, tagging, calling on the brands that are benefiting from this slavery system, and show that they care. Because the biggest lesson I've seen is that if elected officials see that people care, then they will care themselves. Don't count on Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron to be a Human Rights Watch activist and to wake up in the morning thinking, what can I do for Uyghurs? They are not shaped like that. Maybe that's why they are where they are, and that's why I'm in the parliament. But they won't do it unless they see that German citizens and French citizens wake up in the morning and think, my God, Uyghurs are still in concentration camps, so please do something, my elected official. So this mobilization is key, it's central, and that's why public opinion matters. And you have to show that you care. And the second thing is, when you go and shop, you have the list of the companies that are part of this system. Well, I understand that Zara can do something sometimes very nice clothes, but prefer some other brand and say it and show it to Zara, tell it to Zara. And I think that's, we should get out of this thinking that, oh my God, Chinese government, Chinese system is so powerful that we are small citizens in our countries, we can't do anything. No, of course, individually we cannot do anything. But if we create a wave of individuals being showing solidarity, then this wave can have a political impact. So that's why, I saw in the negotiation process of due diligence, if citizens were not mobilized, then never we would have been able to pass this legislation project. And this is helping us a lot. The more you show you care, the more impact we can have then in the institutions to promote solidarity with the Uyghurs and serious measures against those who are committing this crime against humanity.
Thank you. Indeed, now this is very important, the role of the citizens and the constituencies, the electoral constituencies, and of the consumers to try and play a role. I know that Sophie wants to come back briefly on the business part of the questions, and then Sophie, if you want to also address another question that we received that tries to broaden the scope a bit, and says that the Uyghur community is not the only one that is the subject of repression from the central government, and indeed many others in the country are, and there are also violations of international law in Hong Kong, etc. And how the EU's response and international community response should look at the whole picture, as much as perhaps the situation in Xinjiang is one of the most, of course, worrying ones, but there are also many other places inside and outside the borders.
Right. Well, just two very quick points. I want to strongly support everything that Mr. Glucksmann has just said and add to the EP's to-do list, not just the idea of sanctioning responsible government officials, but indeed sanctioning state agencies or entities. I think one of the most powerful steps the US government took last year that's really starting to bear fruit, especially by making companies that don't want to address this issue, force them to address it, was putting sanctions on what's known as the Bingtuan, the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, which is a sort of quasi-military economic entity that's unique to the Uyghur region, but that's deeply involved in business ties. And so if the EU can look at those kinds of state agencies too, that would be, as a target of sanctions, that too would be very helpful. On the second point, we would never suggest that, tragically, that Uyghurs are the only people suffering from human rights violations. If it's human rights defenders, lawyers, journalists, other faith-based communities like underground Christians or Falun Gong practitioners, other ethnic communities, really anybody who challenges the Chinese Communist Party's rule or is perceived to be problematic, even simply migrant workers, are often the target of authorities' ire. And so we do strongly support the call made last year by 50 UN human rights experts to appoint a standing monitor to look at China broadly and to report back to the Human Rights Council regularly, because as much of a crisis there is right now across the Uyghur region, and that requires, we think, a particular kind of reaction, there's a very depressingly long to-do list on behalf of helping other communities too. So hopefully that helps answer our friend's question.
Thanks, Sophie. Indeed it does. And we have a connected question on on the practicalities of how this system of repression works with specific regard to the forced labor, and the fact that the forced labor is not only going on in the Uyghur region in Xinjiang, but also elsewhere in the country. And often people are transferred from there to elsewhere. And so our friend asks whether, is there anyhow possible to rule out that forced labor is happening in other places of the country involving, the Uyghurs or the other Turkic communities, when there are, this allegation of the transfers throughout the country of the communities in camps and in other places. Which might be linked as well to the call to action that you mentioned earlier, Sophie. So, what should the companies do? How can we get to a point where a company can rule out completely that forced labor is not going on in the country?
I would like to weigh in really quick. Virtually speaking, as one of these, the person who had raised the question of if the companies who are even operating outside of the Uyghur region are also tainted with forced labor, I will have to say that virtually the entire industry is tainted by forced labor, since that labor transfer program has been going on for the past couple of years. So it's very, very difficult for brands to completely avoid being complicit in the forced labor as long as they're still operating in China, since that there's a very minimum level of transparency in China with the apparel industry and on the supply chains as well. The point is that the normal ways for due diligence that apply in other countries simply just doesn't work in China, and with the level of surveillance that workers cannot speak with the auditors or investigators freely without putting themselves at risk. So therefore, that it is very difficult for let's say auditors or investigators to be able to get information on their actual conditions. So yeah, I would have to say that entire industry, it is tainted, and I hope that wasn't the case, but therefore, I would suggest all the companies, if they can sign the call to action, commit to the call to action that was launched by the Coalition to End Uyghur Forced Labor. And if people can visit the website and be able to read the full text on the call to action and that which its commitment of asking brands to exit the Uyghur region, and has any links, or doesn't matter if it's in Uyghur region, or as long as it has any ties to Uyghur forced labor or supply chain that might be linked to any types of forced labor in China. And yeah, I hope I answered the question.
Thank you, Jure. I think that was very helpful. I believe that we're running out of time. We only have a couple minutes left, and I guess we want to thank our main host, Mr. Glucksmann. And if you would like to have some concluding remarks before we wrap up, Mr. Glucksmann, please go ahead.
I just want to thank you, Sophie, to thank you, Jure. It's really important, the work you have done. I think this report is fundamental, and I hope that at least parts of it will come to the office of the executive branches of our governments, and that our president in France and our chancellor in Germany will have access to it. So next time when they have a call with Xi Jinping and they don't mention the crime against humanity that is targeting the Uyghur, they will understand that their place in history will be judged more by their action or their inaction when it comes to a nation parked in concentration camps than by the number of contracts they would get for their automobile construction industry or their luxurious products placed in the Chinese market. And this is, this is a debate that we have now. It's almost a full-time job in the European Parliament. What should be our relation with China? Because it's not a foreign policy issue. It's an issue of internal definition also of what we want Europe to be, and big changes will be needed. And there are not only changes in the matter of how high we place human rights in the agenda. There are also changes in our relationship to globalization, to free trade, to the organization of trade. And these changes are coming. And we will have, in any way, to pay a price for the last 30 years of laissez-faire, laissez-aller, when we gave basically the keys of our machines to the Chinese government. And we will have to change it. And we will have to pay a price. But one thing people have to understand is that if we don't pay this price now, it will be a much higher price in 10 years or 15 years or 20 years. And what I'm trying to tell people, because as often when you are perceived as a human rights activist, people tell you, yeah, okay, you care about human rights, but also we have other issues. Yes, we have interest also. Is that our strategic interest as Europeans, our long-term interests, are exactly asking us to do the same things as our principles, which is not being dependent on a system, on a political system that is actually reducing people to slavery and eradicating nations. And if we don't understand that, then it means that we don't care about long-term interests of Europe. We just care about short-term interest of certain parts of European economies. And this is key. It's really a defining moment, both in the US and in Europe. And it's time to show that, okay, I mean, honestly, I'm sure that if there was no cost, no price to be paid, all our leaders will close the camps and ask the Chinese government to close the camps. But that's not the case. Of course, every time you need to do something brave, it means that there is a price. And when it comes to China, yes, it's a big price. But let's be brave enough to pay it now and to make sure that we put enough pressure to change the policy towards the Uyghurs, towards Hong Kong, towards all the oppressed nations and oppressed individuals in China, but also for our interest. And I'm insisting on that, because otherwise, we will be perceived as the ambassadors of Just Human Rights Watch in the parliament. And I consider ourselves as the ambassador of Human Rights Watch, but also of the long-term interest of the European nations and European continents. And I'm very happy to say that actually both push us in the same direction. So that's just the beginning of the fight. It's a long-term issue, but be sure that fighting for Uyghurs, you are fighting for yourselves.
Thank you very much, Mr. Glucksmann, and a reminder to everyone that we might see soon a new resolution from the European Parliament on these issues, and we hope we'll see once again a strong position.
And if I must say, the test for this resolution is very simple, and that's the battle now in the Parliament. We have to be very clear that we will not have the process of ratification of CAI as long as there is this sanction. And then we can have debates of whether or not we need CAI, which I think actually we don't, but okay. But this resolution in few weeks next week should just kill the perspective for the moment of this investment agreement.
The counter-sanction have united the parliament like nothing else has done in the past, as was saying earlier. And we hope to see the same kind of unity and determination when it comes to the underlying reasons why the EU sanctions were adopted in the first place, and to see that resolution. With that, I want to thank you again, Mr. Glucksmann. I want to thank our colleagues and the other co-hosts. The meeting will be closed here, and the recording will be available, will be shared on social media soon. Thank you all very much, and have a nice afternoon or morning, depending on where you are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.